Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Network 2020's briefing on trade, tariffs, and post-Trump, the future of U.S. policy. My name is Courtney Doggart, and I'm the president of Network 2020. And we are delighted. We have got two great people today. We have a wonderful moderator and a phenomenal speaker. So just really quickly, a little background about Network 2020 for those who are joining us for the first time. We are a nonprofit, a New York-based nonprofit that bridges the gap between the private sector and foreign policy worlds. And we're really trying to uncover innovative solutions to foreign policy challenges. And we do that through briefings, but then we also have research programs and educational programs and awards that you'll hear more about in a minute. And what's our next slide, Brian? Here we are. Yes, so the Innovators Awards in Global Affairs. I did want to call this out. We are currently running a competition for innovative young organizations that are taking creative approaches to tackling global challenges. And we're looking at companies that are operating in the sectors of environment, humanitarian aid, security and defense, financial inclusion, global health, and communications and civic engagement. So I think the companies need to be younger than about 7 years, give or take, operating anywhere in the world. You can find information online at globalaffairs.innovators.org or on our website. And we will be announcing the winners during our virtual benefit at the end of March. So just a heads up, if you know of anyone, please do apply. Next slide. Yes, so we are joined today by the Honorable Stefan Selig, who has worked both extensively in the private sector as well as in the government. He's spent over a decade at Bank of America, most recently as the Executive Vice Chairman for Global Corporate Investment Banking. He served as President Obama's Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade at the U.S. Department of Commerce for several years, and he founded BridgePark Advisors that provides personalized strategic advice on critical business and financial issues. So he is very well versed both on the government side and the private sector side. And leading our conversation today will be Network 2020 board member Lisa Rhodes, who is a founder and managing partner of our private equity healthcare company. She has a deep background in the investment world with a focus on the healthcare sector. And for those of you who don't know, she is also an accomplished musician. So we're very lucky to have her many skill sets here today. All right, and for the second time, we are going to be holding a post-event discussion group after. So if you are interested in meeting some of the other people who are on the call, we will be taking about 15 minutes afterwards for people to just share with their thoughts on the conversation today. So at the very end of the discussion, we'll be putting a QR code up on the screen, and that will have a unique link. So please just have your phones ready so that you can click on that and go to the discussion. So I'm done talking. Lisa, Stefan, thank you very much, and over to you.
Great. Thank you, Courtney, and thank you for Network 2020 for always bringing excellent guests. I'm really excited to speak with Stefan, who is an expert in global trade, global commerce, and what's going on in the world today. So we'll get his views. I'm excited to get right into the discussion and seeing the impact of China's strength and the significant changes that we're already seeing with the Biden administration as we enter a new phase of the global economy that once was. So let's get into this discussion so we can get into your questions once we have a chance to hear from Stefan. Why don't we start out with China? I think it's the big question on everybody's mind. Recent news shows that China's economy was the only thing that grew in 2020. Surprise or not surprise? We'll ask Stefan on his views there, and expected to overtake the U.S. economy by 2038, which is getting very close. The relationship is complex as we go from the geopolitical with their relationship with Taiwan and Hong Kong, as well as many other complex issues that are focusing in on the area. So we want to talk a little bit about the world that once was, the world that is, and will that world that will be different? So Stefan, let's start out with some history. I think when we first started to chat, you mentioned something. You said the thinking that allowed China to enter the WHO would alter that they would alter their views on humanitarian other issues that would align more with the Western world did not happen. So give us a little history about our relationship with China and how that's gotten us to the place we are right now.
Thank you, Lisa. And let me thank Courtney and Brian for the invitation to join your organization today. It's gracious for you to have me, and Lisa, for you to spend your time facilitating this conversation. So China was by far and away the most single topic that I had to deal with when I was undersecretary in the Obama administration, and clearly was also the most important topic that the Trump administration faced. And I think, to your point, Lisa, even though the approach with China is likely to be very different in the Biden administration, the fundamental issues that the West and the United States faces are not going to change. And so, to your point, when China acceded to the WHO, we made a bet, we, the United States, but in fact, the Western economies made a bet that by bringing them into the global economy and into the global trade arena, that would cause them to accelerate some of their reforms, economic and commercial reforms, and potentially political reforms. Because once they got exposed to democracy and free markets, there would be no turning back. You know, that ended up, was a reasonable bet that many administrations made, both Republican and Democratic administrations historically, ended up not quite working out that way. And importantly, under President Xi, in many respects, China has gone backwards. And it's clear, certainly from an economic and commercial perspective, that they are not and will not be abandoning their form of state-run capitalism, which is some combination of free markets and state control of what they view to be critical businesses. And as a result of that, what the United States and Western free market economies have to now face is a very large Chinese economy. As you point out, in the aggregate, it will overtake the United States, although I would point out something very important when you cite those statistics. Those are aggregate statistics, whereas economic productivity per capita is still far below where we are in the United States and in advanced Western economies. So while they are getting richer and richer as a country, they are not necessarily getting richer and richer in terms of what their population is experiencing. And they're very focused as a result of this in avoiding what is often referred to as the middle income trap of around $10,000 or so of per capita GDP. And in many respects, this is going to be critical if they are going to get to the next level of their economic development. So their economic development over the last 20 years has largely been driven by infrastructure investments, real estate, and obviously fueling an export economy. But large and advanced economies are largely driven, as is ours, by the consumer. And if they are not able to make that transition to a much more consumer-driven economy, I think their economic growth will certainly stall. This is something that they're very, very, very well aware of.
That's interesting. So you're talking about growth already with them. And we've seen that as they've grown in 2020, the only one that grew, it's the country that's growing, not the people. So let's take that.
Well, the country has been growing, you know, from a much smaller base. So growth, you have to kind of look at because it is coming from a lower level on the one hand, and it is obviously helping their population dramatically. And so one of the things I've always said is, you know, we can criticize China in a whole host of ways, both economically and commercially, and certainly as it relates to some of their policies and human rights policies and what they're doing in Hong Kong and with Uyghurs, et cetera, on the one hand. On the other hand, they have brought over 300 million people out of poverty in the last 20 years, which is more than any country in the history of the world. And as a result of that, they do deserve a lot of credit for creating real prosperity for their country. And this is critical to the success of the Chinese Communist Party, which they fully understand. And so the world is now so integrated and open. So I think the average Chinese person fully appreciates that they do not have the freedom, personal freedoms and flexibility that one enjoys in the West. but they're essentially making a deal with their government, which is we will allow the Chinese Communist Party to remain in control, essentially as long as two things happen. One is you keep us safe and provide for our security. And two is you manage the economy effectively and create prosperity for our people. And as a result of that, their commercial and economic development is and always will be core to what the Chinese Communist Party focuses on.
Very interesting. So growth comes in a different construct for them, but you're also saying that it's from a lower base. And how can we equate that growth of it from China to a U.S. or a more established group, a more established country? Is there any equivalent here? Like if you look at the U.S. not growing this past year versus the significant growth that China had, is there an equivalent? Are they fairly equal? Are they not? Does it matter?
No, they are clearly growing more quickly than Western economies by far. On the one hand, on the other hand, as you rightly point out, that the United States and the West did face this unique event because of the coronavirus. I would say on the other hand, their economy is far less diversified than ours, for example. And one of the things that they are very focused on is their technology and innovation economy. And so they, and now they're seeing this, and they saw this in spades in the Trump administration. They are highly motivated to not be dependent on the United States and the West, for example, in technology, whether that's semiconductors or otherwise, to allow them to become more self-sufficient and not just be a manufacturing hub for the West and the United States. So this goes back to my point earlier, which is they really do need to understand their economy has to be transformed if they are going to continue to enjoy the growth that they have over the course of the last 10 or 15 years.
Right. So that's interesting. That leads to an interesting headline I just read, that the Chinese government is mysteriously rapidly increasing Chinese patent filings. That was addressed in a U.S. government report. So patents and innovation are highly connected together.
So this, Lisa, was at the heart of some of the things that Western companies and U.S. companies have complained about now for a long time, which was counterfeiting and the theft of intellectual property, forced technology transfer, where US and Western companies would have to share their technology in order to have access to the Chinese markets. The Obama administration focused on this. I focused on this. The Trump administration rightly focused on this. And basically what the Chinese essentially were saying is, you know, we were a bit asleep at the switch for the last 200 years. While the West took off, primarily led by the United States. Now we need to catch up. And in order for us to catch up, if we have to steal some stuff, we kind of are going to go do that to get on a level playing field. But once we catch up and we have our own technology, at that point, we fully understand the importance of protecting intellectual property and the value of patents, but we just haven't had them historically. But once we do, we will kind of play more by the rules that you're suggesting. But because we are a less technologically advanced economy, it is just less relevant to us. And so it really was a very kind of self-interested, but in some ways understandable position they took on intellectual property. US companies tolerated it for some period of time, even though it was painful and difficult, because they wanted access to this huge Chinese market. And at some point, Chinese behavior became so problematic that they said the light wasn't worth the candle. And as a result, they started to push back on these sorts of policies. So this is another example of something that is not going away. The key question is going to be, you know, how are we going to live together going forward? There's been a lot of press discussion about entering into a so-called Cold War with China. Actually, some press about maybe even a so-called hot war that might come around because of Taiwan. And you'll saw in the last few days, they've been a little bit more aggressive in terms of some sorties they've been flying over Taiwan. I think actually that is unlikely to be the case. And I think the analogy is not a particularly good one. When you think back on the Cold War, one, the Soviet Union was trying to export their political system in a way that was much different than what China is trying to do in the Chinese specific form of communism. One. Two, and most importantly, the Chinese economy is much, much bigger than the economy of the USSR ever was, and is much more intertwined with the global economy. So the nature of our trade relationship with China, and even now with Russia, is very insignificant. The nature of our economic relationship with China, as President Trump pointed out, is now in fact very significant. So trying to disentangle these two economies at this point, I think, is going to be somewhere between extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible. And lastly, I would say there is real kind of cultural connectivity between our two countries. There's lots of travel and tourism of Chinese tourists coming here. There's lots of, we have a very big Chinese community, as you know, in the United States. And as a result of that, I really don't think a Cold War analogy is apt, but rather an analogy maybe of two divorced parents that have children, which is we can't live together on the one hand, but we have to coexist in some productive way to help raise our children. And so that is more, I think, of an analogy that, a relevant analogy.
Great. So the co-parenting to get us to this next phase of the global economy, whether we want to call it globalization or not, we're still global in our connectivity on that. Let me put that over to the side a second and follow up on a point you mentioned before, which was about how the sectors, as we talk about growth and we talk about intellectual property, one of the things that we're seeing is that China is actually playing by the global rules. I mean, we're starting to see that China is actually using the WTO to their advantage. They're actually the #1 party using the WTO with more cases than anybody else. So they're playing by the rules, and that's an interesting thing. They're trying to work within the system to gain what you're talking about. So there's certain
just to interrupt, I think a lot of people would potentially disagree with that characterization, which is they're not really playing by the rules, but rather gaming the system to their advantage. And that really is a debate that is often not particularly well prosecuted in the WTO on the one hand. On the other hand, you know, my experience in dealing with my colleagues in China was they were highly capable, well-trained, well-schooled, thoughtful, and very professional. And they understand what they need to do to advance the interests of their country. And one of the things I think President Trump got right, even though I think he got a number of things wrong, was that we need to begin to focus more clearly on what we need to do as a country to advance our interests.
Good. Thank you for picking up on that. That's exactly where I'm going. So they're using the system to do it. That makes a lot of sense. Let's go into the different sectors that you talked about. So as China chooses to grow their economy and diversify, there are certain sectors that are really strongly held by them on a global basis, such as semiconductor production. What do you see? What sectors are going to remain in China? What sectors are going to start moving around from China? And do you see anything that we're missing here that will actually be a different sort of perspective on that?
Well, their goal is to have their economy look much more like an advanced Western economy. So you can really just compare what they've done historically to what you see in the EU and what you see in the United States. So what you are already seeing is low value added manufacturing starting to move to other countries out of China, Vietnam, Malaysia, et cetera. And what they're trying to do is replace that with higher value added industries. And that's everything from some of the ones you mentioned to aircraft production, for example. So there's a huge effort in China to create a competitor to Boeing and Airbus that has been much more challenging for them than I think they would have hoped and expected. And so healthcare, all of those things that are A, higher value added, and B, really can help drive their consumer activity, their domestic consumer activity, as opposed to being an export-driven economy. Now, in fact, one of the things I think you're seeing, and you will see in the Biden administration, is our trade policy be less focused than it was historically on the goal of bringing in goods at the lowest possible price. And so, and this started under President Trump, and I think it will continue under President Biden, which is to have the focus of trade policy less around driving GDP by lowering costs in the United States for manufacturers, but more around making sure that employment and trade benefits U.S. workers, as opposed to just is focused on lowering prices for U.S. consumers and U.S. businesses.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. We're just seeing Biden executive order that's talking more as a continuation of the Made in America policy, more of stuff being made in America, and then changing the pricing criteria that we're seeing. And that's an extension of existing policies. Well,
But I do think, Lisa, you will see some real differences. And so one of the things that I think you will see in the new administration is obviously a much closer coordination with our friends and allies to help advance our agenda generally. And certainly that will be the case with our commercial and economic policies and trade policies. I would say that one of the biggest mistakes that the Trump administration made, of which I think there were a number, was withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I spent a tremendous amount of time working on when I was in the Commerce Department, and would have been something that would have been extraordinarily useful for the United States and its partners to be able to influence China on a number of these issues. Now, it's unclear if President Biden will think about rejoining a version of TPP, but I do think that was a severe mistake that was made in the last administration.
So going back to that point, following up on the friends and allies in the global sort of next global phase, you talk about what is the relationship, what role will Europe play in this global process and the relationship between China and the US? How can they help?
Well,
how does that work?
You know, Europe as a bloc is obviously a giant economy. So if you think about our most important trading partners, it would be Canada, Mexico, China, and the European Union. And historically, we've been very aligned for the most part with the Europeans on how to address these issues. The last administration had a policy of kind of going it alone with China, and in fact, on almost all of these issues. And as I said, I expect that at least on China and some of these other issues that the president now will try and lock arms with our friends and allies in Europe to address some of these issues. Because all of these issues that the United States faces, the EU faces the very same ones, which is how do you deal with large state-run enterprises so that you can compete on a level playing field. So US companies do not have fair access to the Chinese market in the same way that German companies don't have fair access to the Chinese market. German companies have to compete against Chinese companies that are largely supported by the Chinese government in the same way that US companies do. And so as a result of that commonality of issues, you could imagine that we would be able to be more effective in potentially pressuring the Chinese to make accommodations if we went together. General Mattis was quoted as saying, if you know you're going to a gunfight, invite your friends with guns. And so I think that's something that I would expect the president to do.
Terrific. Yeah. So what about sort of on a more micro level? What does it say for the recent challenges that Jack Ma has faced within the Chinese government? How does that play out sort of on a global basis, and how does that relate into how others relate to China right now?
Well, look, I just think that was a stark reminder for the Chinese population generally, but for the world about who really the boss is in China. And it's President Xi Jinping. It's not the most successful, richest businessman in China. And so he made that point very, very clear. And the interests of the country and the Chinese Communist Party are always going to come first over even the most successful companies in China. And that's unlikely to change anytime in the near future. And I think that in many ways, Lisa, is at the heart of the issue, which is if in fact the state is going to continue to have a very significant role in the Chinese economy, how are we going to cohabitate in that universe together? And there is no example of this having been done before because of the first point you've made. There has been no country that has been as successful as China that operated on anything like this sort of economic model. And as a result of that, we're kind of learning as we go along, and there are not going to be any easy answers.
That's good. So how do we approach that? So there hasn't been a model. We all know that we all look at innovation when we look at new technologies. We look at innovative business models. How do you see the U.S. trying to approach an innovative model? Is it from the public, the private sector, some combination? What do you see here are the opportunities?
Look, I think if you look at how successful our private sector has been, how successful our technology industry has been, I think that model will continue to have primacy for our country. That being said, even the most successful companies in the world need the help and support of the United States government in certain cases to be successful. And one of those cases, obviously, is dealing with the Chinese Communist Party. But we can't forget, and I was always reminded folks that despite all the issues that the U.S. faces, and now, of course, maybe the biggest issue we face since the great financial crisis with COVID-19, the fact is that we do have the biggest and strongest and most diverse economy in the world. We have the broadest and deepest capital markets. We have the most innovative economy. We have the world's leading university system. We have the rule of law. We have natural resources on our shores that can help propel all of our energy needs. And so when you go through all of those things, we're actually sitting down at the poker table with, three kings in our hand. And so we really are in a good position. And the question then is, how do we leverage those strengths more effectively than we have in the past 4 years, in my view, to really help the U.S. private sector be as successful as it possibly can be?
So a little bit more private sector for our innovation. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I love the pro-America concept. Let's wrap this up. I mean, we've covered Asia, the US, Europe. What about Africa? What role does Africa play in this global economy? And how does Africa work with China, given the recent sort of acquisition of land and all the approaches that they've had on using the abundance of Africa as a continent?
Well, the Chinese have had this Belt and Road Initiative, which is really to try and export infrastructure investment around the world. A large part of that has been in Africa as a way to try and gain power and influence in the African community. And so they have invested far more capital than the West and the United States has over the past 10 or 15 years. Africa is and continues to be kind of a bit of a dilemma, which is this huge continent that I think folks have always looked to for potential future growth. But I think there's a bit of almost a misnomer by thinking of Africa as a market or a country. It is not. It is, dozens of different markets, each of which has their own specific issues and considerations that no one has been able to figure out how to, unlock to drive significant economic growth over an extended period of time.
Yeah, it makes sense, I think. So I think we've covered quite a bit here. Is there anything else before we start taking questions in that you wanted to address on global trade or our relationship with China at this stage? Anything I didn't add?
I guess the only thing we really didn't talk about, which has been in the news, which is tariffs. because as you know, our last president came into office as the self-described tariff king. He put tariffs on steel and aluminum and believed in tariffs. I think that was an area of his trade policy that clearly was not effective. On the one hand, on the other hand, President Biden has not been clear about what his views are going to be in terms of lifting those tariffs. I have the view as a business guy that tariffs really don't work. They are just taxes, and taxes on U.S. consumers and U.S. businesses. So I think that will be a very interesting thing to watch. The other thing I think we'll be getting away from is this focus on our bilateral trade deficit with China, which President Trump was very focused on. I think economists and I never thought that made sense, because your trade deficit has much more to do with capital flows and trade policies than I think the president fully understood. And as you know, even when you decrease trade with your trade deficit with one country, if it goes up with another country, you actually haven't helped your economy in any significant way. So I do think the sort of dialogue that you are likely to see from the Biden administration and the focus is going to change dramatically on the one hand. On the other hand, going back to your first point, I don't think that there is going to be an abdication of this reset, this focus of trying to reset our relationship with China, which has some real issues and issues that are not going to go away anytime soon. And the new administration is going to have to be hard at work. And I think this is more likely to be a generational struggle than it is going to be one for any one administration to tackle.
Great, thank you. Very, very interesting. All right, so yeah, so I think at this point, do we want to open it up to questions, Courtney?
Absolutely, and there are a lot of really good ones coming in through the Q&A box. So if you want to go through there, there are a lot of great ones out there. So thank you everyone who's asking questions. And if you do have any questions to put in, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box.
Yeah, please do that. And Stefan, thank you very much for that overview on China. It sounds we focused all of this on China, but there's also much more to the world than China and the US on the trade perspective. I think there's sort of diversification. So let's get into some questions here and see how we can explore a little bit more. So first one is that Chinese professors really appreciated Biden's victory. Do you think it's going to be any reset of bilateral relationships?
I guess we talked about this a little bit. I think the tone for sure will be different on the one hand. I think on the other hand, the notion that we are going to rewind the clock and go back to some prior period of time, I think is also quite unlikely. So as I said, I think President Biden is going to focus, if not prioritize, on our relationship with China. That's going to have a commercial and economic component. That's going to have an economic component. That is going to have a political component. It will have a climate component. But I think he will have the realization that we cannot address global issues without some sort of cooperation with China. And as a result of that, there are going to be a whole host of things that I think will remain conflict points between the two nations on the one hand. On the other hand, hopefully there will also be a number of areas where we can cooperate, where it's in the world's interest, in the United States' interest, and in China's interest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think very complicated thing in terms of the educational system, how the relationship is with our universities connected in with China, and where the intellectual property comes in. I think that's where that intersection is going to be very interesting right now, about how delicate balance that we talk about, because many of those papers submitted in the support of IP come from these university relationships that we have. That's where it starts. Let's see here. For the next question we have is that in terms of both, one of the questions is, I said that that Africa was the only area that we didn't touch, but one person here is talking about Latin America. And they're asking about, what do you think is the relationship and economic engagement with, through the Biden administration with Latin America? As she's been a
actually
silent presence for quite some time.
So that's a very interesting question. The country that I spent the most time in after China was Mexico, because of the importance of our trade relationship with China. As you know, early in the Biden administration, we entered into the USMCA, the Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement, which was the updating largely of NAFTA. So taking NAFTA for the most part and putting some sort of TPP, some of the TPP provisions into NAFTA to bring it more up to date. But it is, I think, there is no debate about the importance of our economic cooperation with our closest neighbors, Canada and Mexico and Latin America. President Biden, I had the honor of traveling down to Guatemala with the then vice president, and the vice president then, and I'm sure the president now, will continue to have a real interest and focus on Latin America, as he has always had historically, and I think fully understands, not only from an economic perspective, but from a security perspective and from an immigration perspective, that our coordination with our closest neighbors is as important as anything.
Right, right. Thank you. All right, another question here is that talking about what's, I think, on everybody's mind is, how do we get back to the US getting back to work due to the virus, and how do we touch, and how does this work with other countries? Particularly right now, China was able to grow last year when they were looking, when they thought that they got the virus defeated. Now they're having a resurgence of it. So how is that going to impact things as we move forward, and how can we get everybody back to work so the economies will all grow?
You know, look, what I've said from the beginning, which is our economic recovery is going to follow our health recovery. And so the pharmaceutical companies that developed the various vaccines over the last 9 months or so accomplished an extraordinary thing to be able to produce vaccines that quickly, that had been unprecedented, and Project Warp Speed deserves a lot of credit for that, on the one hand. On the other hand, clearly, the manufacturing and distribution of those vaccines has not gone well and continues to be problematic in the United States compared to a number of other countries. I just saw in the paper this week, albeit a smaller country, that Israel is already delivering vaccines to their teenagers. And God knows when, I was going to say older people like us, but I'm probably much older than you, Lisa. So old people like me, get the vaccine. And so I think in order for us fully to get on the road to an economic recovery, that is only going to happen when we have the health situation figured out. And the question is, how long is that going to take, and what sort of lasting damage will there be on the economy? And my concern is that large companies will have been able to have weathered the pandemic much, much better than small businesses. So I'm far less worried about US corporates and US internationals, and that's evidenced by the way their equities continue to trade, which are, at, in many instances, or close to all-time highs on the one hand. On the other hand, local businesses, restaurants, et cetera, that don't have the capital and don't have the resources of large companies are going to be impacted much more dramatically. And it's unclear if and how they're going to be able to recover, but to be sure, we'll face a much harder road than big businesses.
Do you see that? I think that's a really important point, the distinction between the large businesses and small businesses, which has been the economic driver of this country, which is really critical. Have small businesses been an economic driver for China, And are they playing as big a role, or how do you see that distinction between the US and China?
Well, the Chinese economy is quite complex, but for sure they have what we don't have, which are these large state-run enterprises. And the thing about state-run enterprises is that they are funded by the government, and the entire financial system is controlled by the government. And as a result of that, you don't have anything like it. In fact, when I was undersecretary, they really didn't even have a bankruptcy code, because the government was there to prop up and support companies that they thought were strategically important. And this to me is an extraordinarily interesting topic, because economists, I think, all believe, or most believe, that the market is the best allocator of capital, not a political party, and in this case, the Chinese Communist Party on the one hand. But on the other hand, to have the ability for the government of China to support business in times like this, very, very powerful and potentially an advantage for them.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So if you look at the recent articles about IP for China, that China is providing $7,500 per international patent filed, which is, as if you know patents, that's a nice amount that helps a small business start it. So that's very pro small business policy and innovation policy on that. The US used to do that through the government grants and focus in on basic research with the universities, and we've pulled back on that. So that sort of push and pull is like, we on one hand are focused in on developing our small business economy as a driver, whereas it looks like China, some of their policies are actually supportive of the smaller businesses, which may just automatically be grabbed into the larger businesses because that's their model, but it still always bubbles up from the bottom, from innovation upward. So I think that what you're saying makes an enormous amount of sense there, but it always comes back to that idea of innovation and who owns the technology on that. So we do have another question related to Alibaba or Jack Ma thing, which kind of goes into this whole idea. It appears that Alibaba in China may be ahead of Amazon, for example, in automation of warehouses and delivery in the US company. Is the US aware of this? Can you give us some insight on that? That's an interesting question here.
Look, you're talking about two of the most successful companies in the world. Obviously, Amazon was the pioneer in this industry, and I think there could be lots of things to debate, but one probably isn't the success of Amazon. And so I have no idea kind of how they would compare from a technological standpoint against each other on the one hand. On the other hand, Amazon has extraordinarily capable management and access to unlimited capital. And so I would not be particularly worried about Amazon's competitive position. And in fact, you might make the argument otherwise, that just as they, how big can they get and what sort of market power is appropriate for a company of that level of success.
Do you think the US is going to focus in on the market power of these big tech companies, where Amazon is clearly a big tech company at this stage?
For sure, not just the US, and you're seeing this even potentially more profoundly in the EU. But as the size of the biggest tech companies in the United States has grown dramatically. Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, those names alone make up, roughly 25-ish% of the overall equity markets of the United States. And there is a real policy question to ask about the size and market power of those companies. And traditionally, that's something that Democratic administrations have focused on. So I would not be surprised if under the Biden administration, if those topics had renewed focus.
Terrific. Yeah, makes sense. All right, here's one that's relevant to where you are right now. How do you envision the U.S. relationship with the Caribbean? What can we do to engage our maritime neighbors positively to help them build resilience against climate change and have them be more than just resorts and, more importantly, tax havens and economic proxies for China? Can we find something for the Cayman Islands to do other than to own much of Chile?
Well, boy, I'm not an
Little
expert on.
editorial comment and a question in the same thing. Having been a resident of Bermuda for 11 years, I get that question.
Right. I guess somebody could tell from my background, I'm in the French West Indies at the moment. But, look, I think the climate change point, and for countries the size of Caribbean nations, really just does underscore the importance of global coordination that we really have seen less of in the last 4 years, because we're not going to be able to tackle these issues unilaterally. And so that to me is something that I think is highly likely to change in the next administration, and is the president was already kind of focused on that topic. As you saw, one of his first executive orders, if it was not his first one, is to rejoin the Paris Climate Accords. And so I think we're going to see a very, very different posture. But, historically, the Caribbean economies are very, very dependent on, the U.S. economy and travel and tourism. And I'm not sure that there's very much that the U.S. economy can do unilaterally to necessarily change that, other than getting the COVID-19 behind us, which obviously has been devastating to travel and recreation, and has had a very significant impact on not only travel and tourism, but the cruise lines, the hotel industry, amongst others, which those countries are so dependent on.
Right. Do you see, just sort of a corollary to that before we go into the next question, do you see any sectors not surviving this COVID-19 crisis?
Well, I don't know that it's not surviving. I think the more interesting question is, how do they change? And so, for example, is the office of the future different? Is the way that people work different? Is what we're doing now on Zoom is that going to be the way that this organization is going to convene going forward, as opposed to doing it live? And if so, what are the implications for conference spaces? What are the implications for technologies like Zoom, et cetera? I do think that what the coronavirus has done is accelerated a lot of changes that were already beginning to happen, but were happening much, much more slowly. And so as a result of that, I really do believe that the global economy coming out of coronavirus, will be somewhat different than it was going into it. And like is always the case, you're going to have winners and losers.
Yeah, exactly. So that goes back to the original point. We were saying what the world was, what it is now, and what she will be in the future. Can you paint a little bit of a picture of what you think the future of the U.S. economy might look like, given that commercial real estate is definitely going to be transformed into a new type of business?
Look, I'm bullish on the U.S. economy over the long term. For sure, on the one hand. On the other hand, because of coronavirus, because of the massive deficits, you could be entering a world in which taxes are going up, inflation could be rearing its head again. And so I do think we may be entering into a period of much more uncertainty and potentially more volatility in the economy over the next number of years.
Fair enough. Yeah, hard to have that crystal ball, right?
Yeah,
you'd be there. So another question from the group is, can you compare and contrast the income disparity of the U.S. versus China? For example, the U.S. middle class income growth has stagnated since the 70s, while 5% and above have grown dramatically. So while China is growing in the middle class since World War II, are we stagnating ours in the U.S.?
Well, this I think really gets to the point I think I made at the outset, which is, per capita GDP in the United States is still, I don't know, 5 times higher than it is in China. And China is also suffering from some of the same issues that we're suffering from in the West of the United States in terms of income inequality. You do have Jack Ma, but you also have, a large lower working class in China still. And this, to me, is an issue that, is going to be resonant all over the world. And as China continues to grow and develop, they're going to have to face it more profoundly as Western economies are. But I think this, to me, is in fact part and parcel of the trade questions that we started with, which is trade, has become kind of this very kind of politically divisive topic on the one hand. On the other hand, it really shouldn't be, right? Because two countries, companies, people would never trade with each other if both people were not better off. That's the definition of what trade is. Both parties want to do it. The problem with trade and globalization that has arisen over the course of the last 20 years is that while it's better for the overall economy, it is not necessarily better for everyone in the economy. And there were clearly people in our country that have been left out and communities that have been left out. And so while all of us are buying TVs and cars for less money than we might otherwise have been, or have buy our sneakers for less money because we're sourcing them from the Far East, that has also created real inequality, has led to job losses in the United States, has led to a hollowing out of our manufacturing sector. And that has to be addressed in a way that has not been addressed historically with trade policy. And I think is going to be at the center of what the Biden administration was focusing on. And in fact, while they did it potentially less artfully, was in fact something that the Trump administration was trying to get at.
Right. So maybe they're breaking it so we can help now fix it and come up with a solution toward it. Very interesting. Fair enough. A couple more questions here. Can you discuss the importance of the fact that the U.S. is largely in debt to China? What is the long view on that? And are we still in debt with China? I'll have to ask that question. I'm not certain.
Yeah, they're the biggest buyer of our bonds by far. And as a result of that, we have this kind of interesting relationship, which is, anything that they do that would decrease the value of those bonds, for example, driving in inflation, is actually perverse to their interests. And so the Chinese economy is a savings economy, and those savings have largely gone into, or not, I don't know if it's largely, but a large portion of those savings have gone into U.S. government bonds over the course of the past 20 years. And I think that's going to continue. That's going to continue to be the case.
So the bonds are one of our shared children that we have to deal with, right?
That's yes.
Exactly. So our children are still in school and we're paying for it. Got it. One other question here about supply chains. Supply chains are a critical factor in international trade. How does the rise and in the use of tariff affect on the virus affect those supply chains? And that's a really
that's a great question, and something we probably should have talked about earlier. But one of the things I think you're clearly you already are seeing, you're going to see more of, is U.S. companies relying less on China in their supply chains. One. Two is companies all around the world diversifying their supply chains where they're not reliant on any one country. And in fact, this goes back to the lower prices comment, reshoring a lot of those capabilities to ensure more regular and secure sources of supply going forward, as opposed to just, I can buy the masks lower when they're made in China, but if I need them, I'm not going to get them. And so I do think this is an example of something that is going to be a real change in how companies do business going forward, coming out of both the coronavirus and two, the trade tensions trade tensions with China, which is the diversification of supply chains generally, and certainly potentially moving out of China in certain circumstances where possible.
Right. So actually, how do you then, I'll put a corollary to that, how do you wean the US economy off of cheaper goods across the board for ensuring security of supply? Because we've all sort of been, we were raised on these cheaper goods, and now it's a big shock to the system.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's exactly that, which is we are going to be making a trade-off between security and price. And where price has had primacy in the past, it is now going to be tempered by security.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I think that, Courtney, I think that that kind of covers the questions here. And I may just wrap it up over to you. So, Stefan, I really would thank you, first of all, for your insights and your great depth of knowledge on global trade, on China in particular. The depth of knowledge there is extraordinary, and the experience there. And you've raised some really important points that we've gone over. So, you know, trade is a major part of the Biden administration. He's got a lot to work with China. How are we going to take those policies and create something that's an economic value for us? What you've seen here with COVID has accelerated the changes that were already underlying the current global trade center, and diversification of the supply chain is something that is a consequence of COVID, but also that accelerated change in global supply. So Stefan, those are some key points that you had. I want to just leave it to you to see, is there any other comments or anything else you'd like to share with our group before we give it over to Courtney to wrap it up for this wonderful dialogue that you've honored us with?
Nothing other than thank you again for your invitation.
Thank you. Thank you. Courtney?
Terrific. Thank you both so much. Lisa, wonderfully moderated, and Stefan, thank you so much. Your depth and breadth of knowledge is tremendous. So we really appreciate your taking the time. Just a couple of housekeeping items. Our next briefing is next Monday, same time at 12. And for those of you who don't know, the Doomsday Clock is the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists annual assessment of how close humanity is to destroying itself with its own created technologies and things like climate change and nuclear weapons. So they will be releasing their assessment this Wednesday, and then we'll be talking about it on Monday. So it should be a really interesting discussion with Rachel Bronson, who's the president of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and Dr. Herbert Lin, who really knows a lot of stuff on the cyber side of things. So that's our next event. If you would like to join our post-event discussion group, so we have a bunch of QR codes, but if you're not QR code savvy, you should have received an email about an hour ago that also has a link. And so it takes like a few minutes. What you'll do is if you click on this link, it will take you to another discussion, and you just need to wait until this webinar ends before you can join that. And we are a nonprofit. And if you are able to donate, we would really appreciate it, because we'd love to keep these briefings going once we enter into a post-COVID world, as we all start to slowly see that glimmer of hope. So, you know, please do, if you can donate and support our work, especially these virtual briefing series. We've had people join from, I think, about 90 countries around the world. So it's really wonderful. And again, if you'd like to RSVP for the event on Monday, please do. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. They were excellent. And again, Lisa, and especially Stefan, thank you so much. It was really an eye-opening conversation. Take care.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.